Today we talk about the future of digital diagnostic tools. And with us today we have Emrah, who is one of the co-founders of neotiv. Welcome, Emrah, and we're really happy to have you here at the RoX office.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
So today we speak a lot of digital tools, and when we talk about solutions in the digital health area, often we think about therapeutics. But there are so many diseases that really start in our bodies way earlier, and we need to understand them before they really break out and we can feel the symptoms. So are there digital therapeutics or digital diagnostic tools that really can understand the subtle changes inside our bodies before they break out?
Yes, I think that's something where digital tools really help us to accelerate development because they form a translational bridge between research and implementation that is often much faster than when you use the traditional research tools and research methods. And of course, our interest here is Alzheimer's disease, where we think that with digital diagnostics, you can recognize the disease much earlier than you can do with traditional methods.
And there is also often a difference between active monitoring and passive monitoring. Can you explain the difference and what it means for patients?
Yeah, so passive monitoring basically is just looking at usage data. So not so much user data, but usage data. So how people use their smartphones, how they basically, what type of activities they engage in everyday life. And these are data about, the number of people you call, the way you write SMSs, the way your motor coordination works when you write something with your smartphone. So all these are passively recorded. And the interesting thing is that it's all the same data, but because the data are so rich, the idea is that through machine learning and intelligent algorithms, you can extract features that may be specific for certain types of conditions. And in active sensing, that's very different. In active sensing, you basically customize a feature for a certain condition, and then the user is actively engaged in basically delivering data for that feature, very specifically. So I think the difference is that with active sensing, you already know what type of sensitivity specificity you have, you know the feature, whereas with passive sensing, you just collect data. You don't even know what type of feature will come out at the end. And then you try to make sense of the big data that you have. I'm in favor of active sensing, obviously, because I think that passive sensing is very interesting, but it is very difficult to do something individualized out of it. Because at the end, we want that a single data set of a single person can provide meaningful information. And that's, I think, very difficult to achieve with passive sensing.
Can you make us an example about how this active sensing works, for example, in the Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah. Maybe I'll give you a very general example. So, imagine you want to find out if somebody has fever. So one way you could do this with passive sensing is basically you just sense how the person goes through a daily routine. And then if you find out that the person maybe sleeps in the afternoon and maybe changes his shirt or her shirt during the night, then maybe these features give you some indication about that there may be fever, because these are maybe behaviors accompanying fever. You could also just ask the person to measure their temperature with a thermometer, then that would be active sensing. So obviously passive sensing would work, because if you have a million data set, then I think these two features would be highly predictive of fever. But they would not work so much in an individual basis. There would be a high failure rate. Whereas the active sensing always would give you the temperature that you need. And so in Alzheimer's field, of course, the active sensing feature that we are looking for is cognition, because that's the thing that's really impaired in Alzheimer's disease. And that's the key clinical measure that you need to obtain. So our idea is that we need to assess certain cognitive functions by actively engaging patients to actually solve exactly those functions and those tasks.
Do you see a lot of challenges in digital tools when it comes to working with patients that are maybe cognitively impaired already?
Yes, so obviously that's a big challenge. So usability is one of the biggest challenges, particularly for those types of diseases where cognition is impaired or some health aspect just impairs usability a lot. In the Alzheimer's field, the situation is that we actually have to detect these cognitive problems very early on. Long before cognition is impaired to a degree that usability is strongly compromised. So in those stages, it's not such a big problem. But of course, we also need data along the full continuum, this preclinical continuum of Alzheimer's disease. So it's very important to ensure that people can actually continue using when they get progressively more impaired.
We just heard the National Dementia Strategy here in Germany, and it really highlights also this diagnosis really early on when it comes to Alzheimer's. Do you see here also really not just for the individual patient a benefit, but in general also for research, for understanding the disease better?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the main challenges in Alzheimer's disease is that we still understand very little about the cognitive trajectory in this long preclinical course of Alzheimer's disease. We don't really know how fast cognition declines. And we also know very little about what factors actually influence this. So lifestyle factors are very important, and we have very little understanding of their impact. Nutrition, of course, very important. There are a lot of medications that can influence cognition positively or negatively. It's very hard to measure those. And it's also very hard, basically, in the current setting, to engage citizens to contribute to drug development, for instance, by participating in studies. And all this can be solved when if we have tools that actually have a low threshold of access for the general population, and that can track cognition with high frequency, accompanying everyday life with little intrusiveness, and so that you actually can collect all these relevant data. And I think that's where I hope that the dementia strategy will actually also increase awareness in the population towards contributing more to research by actually also engaging with digital tools, for instance, in citizen science projects to actually contribute to science.
Yeah, and you mentioned that citizen projects, for example. I know that at Neotiv you also did something like this. Can you tell a little bit about how that project went?
Yeah, so for instance, we were interested in finding out how the common flu influences cognition, because we know that inflammation in the body can actually impair brain function. But obviously, in the normal research setting, it's very difficult to investigate this because you can never predict when someone will have a flu, and you need to have a very wide reach out. And that's why we made this citizen science project with Neotiv. It actually went quite well, so we had over 2,000 people who participated. I think we would like to repeat this actually, particularly now with the COVID crisis, and we are now setting up a new citizen science project, particularly geared towards COVID-19, in order to understand whether it has any influence on cognitive function. So we will follow it up.
Thank you, Emrah, for all these really inspiring things that you brought up. And I hope you will have lots of success with that project and also in the future with Neotiv. And thank you for being our guest here at the RoX office.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Uwe from RoX. I'm co-founder and I'm responsible for business development and sales. And we're enabling startups to come into business.